Hi everybody, welcome back for Chapter 10 of Attaboy Sam. Chapter 10. We'll be down in a few minutes, Catherine, Mr. Krupnick called. We have some last-minute birthday things to attend to. We won't be long, Mom, Anastasia called. They were standing in the upstairs hall outside Sam's room. Mr. Krupnick held his large package under one arm, and Anastasia had her green notebook in her hand. They could hear Mrs. Krupnick down in the kitchen where she was arranging the yellow flowers in a vase. "Okay," she called back cheerfully. "Don't be long, though. Mrs. Stein will be here soon." Carefully, as if the door might be holding back a ferocious monster, Sam turned the knob. Then he pushed the door open very slowly and stood aside so that his father and sister could enter his room. His father coughed. Anastasia made a gagging sound. Both of them blinked in confusion. Sam, by this time, was so accustomed to the condition of his room that it no longer surprised him, but he tried to imagine how it might seem to people entering for the first time. The smell was overwhelming. It smelled like... Well, Sam couldn't even describe what it smelled like. "What do you think it smells like?" he asked his father and sister nervously. Somewhere, way back in his imagination, a tiny bit of hope still lingered. He hoped that just maybe his father and sister would say, "It smells like the finest, most unusual perfume in the whole world. The finest perfume ever invented." Myron Krupnick sat down on Sam's bed with his package on his lap. He considered Sam's question carefully, sniffing occasionally to test the scent again as he thought. Now and then he coughed. Finally, he said, "Once, in 1981, I attended a conference in New York during a week when the New York garbage collectors had been on strike for 17 days. So the garbage was piled up in the streets. It was August, very hot. Just outside my hotel, in front of a Thai restaurant, was a particularly awful pile of green plastic garbage bags. They had split open, and the stuff had oozed onto the sidewalk, and flies had laid eggs on it, and the eggs had hatched, and... Are you sure you want to hear this?" Sam shook his head. "I don't think so," he said. Sam's dad reached over and took Sam's hand to show that they were still pals. "Anyway," he said, "this smells like that." Sam, holding his dad's hand, looked at Anastasia. "What do you think it smells like?" he asked miserably. She had been thinking. "Well," she said finally, "once at school, an 8th grade girl named Martha Holmes was coming down with the flu. And after lunch she felt really crummy, like she was going to throw up. And she was standing in the hall in front of her locker with the locker open, and she felt embarrassed because everyone was walking past, even boys, and so she stuck her head inside her locker and barfed egg salad sandwich and tomato soup and chocolate pudding on top of her gym suit and a math book. Then she closed her locker and locked it and went right home and didn't come back to school for 5 days. But on the 4th day, when she wasn't back yet, the principal told the janitor to open up the locker because everybody was noticing that something was wrong, and... Are you sure you want to hear the rest of this?" "No," said Myron Krupnick firmly. "No," said Sam in a small voice. Anastasia reached over and took his other hand to show that they were still pals. "Anyway," she said, "this smells like that." The three of them sat silently for a moment. They breathed little choking breaths. No one even said anything about the sound, a sound like bubbling lava that was coming from the toy box. "Sam," his dad asked at last in a sympathetic voice, "what is it?" Sam tried to speak very matter-of-factly. Though it wasn't easy, he tried to use a brave and self-confident voice. "It's perfume," he told them. "Homemade." "I see," Mr. Krupnick said after a long silence. "Well, I can't sit here very long because it's very tough to breathe, but I promised I would show you mine." He untied the string around his package. "Let me explain before I show you," he said. "First of all, I used my favorite photograph of your mom, a black and white one where she was wearing a sweater, and her hair, back when she had long hair, was blowing in the wind. Remember that picture? I had it framed and it was on the desk in my office." Anastasia and Sam nodded. They had both visited their dad's office at Harvard, so they knew the picture he was talking about. "Well, I had that photograph enlarged until it was enormous, poster size. Then I glued it to a piece of plywood that was so nice and sturdy. Then I borrowed some paints from my friend Morris Castillo, who teaches in the art department. And in the hours when I wasn't busy teaching or grading papers, I worked on painting that photograph." I was going to make it a gorgeous portrait, he said unhappily. I wanted to show her beautiful blue eyes and how the sunshine made golden streaks in her hair and... He sighed and looked miserably at the package on his lap. Show us, Dad, Anastasia said sympathetically. Yeah, show us, Sam urged. Mr. Krupnik slid the picture out of its paper wrapping and stood it against the side of the toy box where they could see it. Sam gulped. It was terrible. Scary. It looked like a wild thing from one of his favorite books. It was almost as terrifying as a hammerhead shark. If it were hanging on your bedroom wall, Sam thought, you would never, ever be able to close your eyes and go to sleep. He glanced at his sister. Her mouth was open in astonishment as she stared at the hideous painting. What does it look like to you guys? Mr. Krupnik asked. And Sam knew, because Sam had experienced it, that deep down in his dad's imagination was one teeny-weeny bit of hope that maybe the painting was okay after all. They didn't answer for a moment. Finally, Anastasia said, Dad, you know what it looks like? Once this 8th grade girl at school, Martha Holmes, barfed egg salad sandwich and tomato soup on top of a green gym suit. Sam began to giggle. He didn't want to hurt his dad's feelings, but he couldn't stop giggling. He looked over and saw that Myron Krupnik's shoulders were shaking, and he realized that his dad was laughing too. Anastasia halted her description. She picked up her green notebook and opened it to a folded piece of paper. When she unfolded the paper, Sam could see that Anastasia had used her calligraphy pen and lettered her poem carefully onto the page. Here's mine, Anastasia announced. She began to read. Sam had heard the poem before, all but the last part that Anastasia had added only that afternoon, so it didn't really surprise him anymore. He watched his father's face. His father was an expert on poetry. He taught poetry at Harvard. He wrote poetry that was published in books, and people, sometimes people who didn't even know his father, bought the books. Anastasia read aloud. I'm glad that you are 38. I'm glad you're Catherine, not just Kate. I'm glad our father is your mate. Your size and shape are really great. You have a daughter and a son who think you are a lot of fun. As mothers go, you're second to none. In fact, you are a perfect one. Your favorite food is broiled scrod. You never ever are a clod. Your haircut is a little odd. It doesn't seem to match your bod. You don't like mice or rats or bugs, but for money you paint slugs. I hope you like your birthday cake and that your stomach will not ache. Anastasia looked up. Very slowly she folded the paper, but instead of returning it to her notebook, she leaned down and placed it in front of her father's painting, which was leaning on the toy box. Then, in a very grown-up and dignified voice, Anastasia said, I know it's not very good, but please feel free to tell me what you think. Sam could tell, watching her, that Anastasia, like himself and his father, still had a teeny bit of hope about her poem. Sam didn't say anything but watched his father. His father had once won the National Book Award for a volume of poetry. Sam didn't know what the National Book Award was, but he knew that it was important, and that his father was important, at least in the world of poetry. Mr. Krupnik cleared his throat. Then he said, very slowly, Once, in 1981, I attended a conference in New York. It was a hot week in August, and the New York City garbage collectors had been on strike for 17 days. And in front of a Thai restaurant near my hotel, Anastasia started to giggle. So did Sam. Their father did too. The three of them, Myron Krupnik, Anastasia Krupnik, and Sam Krupnik, laughed and laughed. They sat side by side on Sam's bed in the most foul-smelling room in Massachusetts, looking at the worst painting in Massachusetts and the worst poem in Massachusetts, which were both resting on the only toy box in Massachusetts that made a rumbling, sprouting sound that, as they laughed, grew louder and louder. They were still laughing when the perfume exploded.